We're going to open with a silent prayer, if you will kneel. Okay, so we're going to do the 25-20 today, and I don't know if you can remember that far back. It's been a little while since we've done any 25-20, but we'll do some more revision today, so hopefully that will help. I've pre-written up a fair bit today so that it'll save a little bit of time me writing on the board. What I've started off with is just a description of where we've covered so far in terms of the 2009 study. So that's the 25-20 revealed study that was done by Elder Paminda. And we've actually done quite a few. I've done 5, 6, 7, I've done quite a few of them already. So I'm just going to refresh our minds of where we've been. Before we started the 2009 study, we did a little bit of just an overview of 25-20 in general. Then also we covered Miller's work and Edson's work, just to get that establish that sort of history part, and that was basically numbers 1 to 4. So number 5 is my number 5, my part number 5, my part 6 and 7. So when we started the 2009 series, the first part we went to was these first three here are actually to defend the 25-20 generally as still applicable today. So before moving forward into like an increase of knowledge so much, these 3 were to just establish the foundation that the 25-20 is relevant and true and applicable. So in number 5, part 5, we reviewed how it was wrong that they discarded the 25-20. So part of the reasoning for that was that there was after 1844 passed, the pioneers went back and did a review of all of the doctrines that they had, and the things that were on the chart basically, which was a visual guide of the methodology and that they've been using, and they went back and did a review, and all the things that they had there, apart from the problem had been understanding of what the sanctuary was and where that was, but apart from that, the 25-20 basically passed that review. The charts were then endorsed, and we can see that Ellen White had endorsed the charts, and the 25-20 was on the charts, and we talked about what the mistake had been that was referred to, when she talked about the mistake in some of the figures. So we gave that a tick, and then Elder Paminda had then, in his study, just addressed some of the arguments that James White / Uriah Smith had made, and others. Some of those arguments that they had to play down the importance of it, or really just make it as an irrelevant, or their arguments basically, and then he was responding to that. So we talked a bit about some of the languages, the original languages, and we talked about how they viewed the dichotomy that they had between time prophecy and also whether it had to do with the destruction, like the literal destruction of the time, and that they held it as an either-or position. And so just compared the modelling that they had and how they reasoned it, and then how we would respond to some of those arguments. So we covered that. I did a little bit of this, continued into this number 6, because we didn't finish it in number 5. So, and in number 6, that one I called it the importance of events, because in 2009, one of the things that Elder Paminda did was to bring in 3 parables to try to explain how important it is to understand the events. So if you remember, or if you can imagine or go back to 2009, there was nobody in this movement was doing time setting, right? But they were using events as a way of, like waymarks, to measure the progression along the line. And the point was that you need to be able to recognise the correct events, and that's how you can gauge the time. So if we're not looking at the right events, we'll miss it. And so the 3 parables that were brought in at that point to explain that was comparing with ancient Israel And when in the time of Christ, people at that time, the Jews at that time, were missing the events. They were not conscious of which events were important to notice and which ones weren't, and they didn't understand the times in which they were living, the internal events and the external events that they were supposed to be paying attention to. So that point was brought forward. Another one was the concept of examinations and the fact that we as human beings seem to need motivating to prepare for testing and challenges and things like that, to get rid of that complacency. And so in terms of the examination, we know that the closer we get to the exam, the more stressed perhaps we become, or the more motivated we become to prepare ourselves. And in the same way, the events that we're tracking, as we see things coming closer and closer, they're really important for not just being aware, but also to motivate us to really examine ourselves and prepare ourselves, and to then prepare others. So that was brought in. And the third parable was the Dark Ages, and just line upon line comparing the Dark Ages with the end of the world, and how this picture of it being easy or a glorious time of evangelism, it sort of didn't. We also need to take into account that the Dark Ages is like a type of the end of the world as well. So we need to be aware that it's quite, it will be not necessarily easy. And so that was brought in as well. So we talked about those, and then it was also compared with today, and we had the imagery of a train, the Sunday law train coming from the right-hand side, and people standing on the track, looking perhaps the wrong way, and then the Sunday law can come and take them out because they're looking in the wrong direction. And that imagery was also brought in, and just making it relevant to our dispensation, because obviously if people don't know what the Sunday law is going to look like, they're going to be looking for all the wrong signs. So I think also brought in, just a parable of my own about when my family had been caught in a storm, just how we need to be able to recognise the correct events. So that's the topics that we covered there. And then number 7, we talked about what Miller and Edson had missed, and the point was that we're going to take their work and use it moving forward. And we were just clarifying some of the areas which maybe we no longer hold to. Miller's mistake was primarily that his understanding of the sanctuary and where it was, and that affected his understanding of the 10 kings and where that all fitted in. That was a reasonably sort of small point, I guess, but still important to be conscious of, that we no longer sort of apply it exactly the same way. But being aware of how he did apply it, maybe there's some ways that is still educational for us. Edson, so Miller, there's a 65-year prophecy. We talked about the Panic of 742, the history surrounding that. There was a prophecy about 65 years. Basically, it was like God warning that there's going to be a 25-20 coming up. And Miller had recognised that both kingdoms, the Northern and the Southern Kingdom, had been involved in that. But Edson, when he was trying to dispute Miller's model of the 25-20, the different times that Miller had focused on, Edson had really so focused on the one storyline that he dismissed. He didn't dismiss one of the kingdoms entirely, really. And so we talked about that, how that affected it, because if he had have recognised both, the validity of both, then he, it's actually the combining of the two, which is where all the light comes out. And so that opportunity was really missed back then, because he failed to really consider that Miller's perspective was also true and valid. And so he wrote off one, and so they ended up with just basically a mess, and then they just got rid of the 25-20 altogether. So we talked about that. Then from there, we moved on to really the main substance of study, I think, is to bring both of the 25-20s together and connecting what you call Miller's line and Edson's line together, seeing how they're actually talking about just basically two perspectives of the one story. And when you can bring them together, then it creates what will become our conclusion, and basically a structure that's formed which illustrates, it can bring in the 1863 and all of that, but we'll get there eventually. So to bring the two 25s together, two 25/20s together, we are looking at 3 passages in the Bible. Christ's discourse, which we take from 3 books in the Gospels, and basically bring all that information together, examining what Christ had to say about his prophetic discourse about the end of the world, the structure that Christ gave when you analyse it, the dispensations that can be broken up into. I'll do a little bit of revision on that this morning. That's relevant because that has to do with the 25/20. We'll see why in a moment. We're also going to go to the book of Revelation in chapter 11. That's also relevant, and it also ties in through proof texting with what Christ had to say. So we'll look at that today. I've done a bit of that for the last couple of sessions. We've sort of just headed towards Revelation. And then the third passage we're going to go to is Daniel chapter 9. We haven't been there yet, and I won't do that today, but maybe next time, hopefully, I'll do that. Those 3 passages all together, they all interlock with each other. They all also all do a work of connecting 1798 with 1844, paganism, papalism, all of those themes that we have, the treading down, all of those things that brought together and illustrated to be all connected as one thing through these 3 passages. So the Gospels, Revelation and Daniel all together. So last time when I did an interactive study with you guys, and it was lots of fun. I hope to have some fun today as well, and I probably will try to make it a little bit interactive as well. But what we did last time is we went and looked at literal to spiritual, and you know, we kind of throw that around. We're going to get used to doing that, but what I wanted to do was just take us back to some examples in the Bible where it's really clear that we take literal things and we apply them in spiritual ways, and they have spiritual meaning. And we looked at some examples. I'll just do that in a moment again. And the reason I did all of that was so that we could go to Revelation 11 verses 1 to 2, because that's exactly what we're going to do when we get there. So that's a little review of where we've been so far. Why do we want to know the 25/20? You know, why is this important? Because this is used in the Midnight Cry message. It's used, it's been applied in the past. It's going to be applied, I suppose, in the future as well, as more of these time prophecies are being used. And we see, you know, in the Acts 27 line, we see the 25/20 come up again shortly. So we know that it's still relevant, and many of us have maybe joined the movement more recently and maybe don't understand the reasoning or how these things were developed and whether they can be depended on and relied upon. So I'm hoping to just bring everybody together, I guess, on this, myself included, so that we can have confidence when the 151 is used, the 126, 63, and there's a few like that, so that we have confidence because we know how these things were arrived at and what it's based on. All right, so that's that part. Okay, so just reminding us of what we did last time I spoke, when we spoke about literal to spiritual, we looked at these verses, and there was more as well. We looked at, in this verse, we saw that there was flesh and blood and a wrestling, and how it was not against, you know, we know it's not against flesh and blood, it's against spiritual powers and things like that. So we can see the usage of literal to spiritual in that verse. Helmet and sword, we know it's not literal now. These things all symbolise bigger things, I suppose. Bread and manna, day, how we use prophetic time. Israel, again, if you go to that verse, it's explaining who Israel is now, or in that dispensation. And then we know Babylon and wine and all of those things, and we're all familiar with a lot of that. But when we start to examine some of our key words, such as you know, what is not real and what is real, it's good to just get some of that back into our memories. So I will ask you to interact now, if you're willing to. I did put literal and spiritual here, and I wonder if anybody can remember any of the terms that we used that we would put under each category, if you can remember any. I guess nobody can remember. Maybe any other terms that we did last time.
Maybe if you give us a start, that might trigger some memory.
Alrighty. Maybe I'll just put forward the combinations, the word combinations, and again, people can tell me which category to put them into, because that's what we did last time. I just thought maybe sometimes some of us would remember them. Okay, type and anti-type. So where would you put type and where would you put anti-type?
Type is literal and anti-type is spiritual.
Thank you. Yep. Good. All right. What about I remember, Lynn, even I think this was your idea, we had temporary and lasting. Do you remember which way we would put those around?
You sure that was my idea?
It was.
Temporary and lasting. I think temporary is literal and lasting was spiritual.
Yeah. And the reason we said temporary in that, there's this thing about this idea about the grass withers and fades away and all of these things. I don't know if you remember, but I did draw it up this way. I just didn't put all my little pictures in there so clearly. It's a bit reflective with the light, but in here I've got a tree, I've got some grass, I've got, like a city, that's Jerusalem. I've got a mountain, I've got the sun, the cloud, I've got an animal or a beast. These things are the literal things that we're looking at, which explain the spiritual. And sometimes we think, oh, the spiritual is over here, but I did make the point that some of these spiritual things are eternal, and we're talking about higher concepts, maybe things that are broader, so we'll look at that again too. But the temporary nature, it makes us aware that the focus of what we want to understand when we read the Bible is the lasting. We want to know the spiritual. So a few other things I had there was the idea of what you can see and all that there is. So I would have put what you see here, what we can see, but it's not all there is. The spiritual is all there is. Another couple that I had was fast brain and slow brain. So it's very easy to make literal to literal applications. It's an easy trap for people to fall into. So that's a fast brain here, slow brain here. And you can even see, to prove any of these, the spiritual meanings of them, it does take some effort and work. You have to explain what the actual spiritual meaning is. That's slow, it's slow work, it's not quick and easy. Then we talked about child and adult. So children tend to use fast brain, they tend to focus on what they can see, things that are temporary, that they kind of have, they're focused on the immediate surroundings and all that concerns them. But as adults, as spiritual adults, we need to slow down, think about the meanings of the literal terms that we see in the Bible. And so when we're coming to Revelation 11, we'll be doing that. So I'll put adult here. Another term that we had was example and the actual thing. So the example is here. It's like God makes a little model kit of the world, some toys, Lego or something. Makes up a kit, gets us to sit down in front of it, gets us to have a look at it, and he says, see that? That's what my kingdom is like. Does that make sense? So this would be the example, all that we can see in the world. A mountain is a kingdom, all of that. So put the example. And this is the actual. And a lot of these literal things, they don't exactly match the spiritual. There's aspects of them that resemble the spiritual, but they're not identical, obviously. So the point really being then this terminology that we sometimes use about things being not real or real can be confusing to people. When we think about what's real, we usually think what we see with our eyes right now in our world around us is the real thing. And the idea of what is in heaven or spiritual things feels like it's not real. It feels a little bit like a hologram where you can't get your hands onto it. It's not tangible. But in fact, we really need to think in terms of this literal side being the not real and the spiritual reality that we want to learn. That's the real thing, especially when parables being used. The real thing is the spiritual and the literal is the not real. I'll put that in quotes because obviously things are real, but when we're thinking about them as temporary or used as like a model, then we can consider them to be not the real thing or not the real point of the parable. So we put not real and real there. All right, so let's just have a look at some things that are either real or not real. So we have this symbol in the Bible, C, a C. Okay, what does a C represent?
Multitude.
Multitude. So I'll draw that. Okay, lots of people. So which one is real out of those two? You know, the sea is a real thing, right? But the multitude, or these peoples, you put multitude there, they're real, right? They're real. Another example I thought of was a lamb. All right. Now, lamb can represent a few different things. Perhaps somebody can say something that a lamb or a lost sheep or something like that, a sheep can represent.
Can represent like somebody who's should be a follower of God. So they could be, it could represent Christ, or it could represent the flock that he is searching for, which is really just repeating the same analogy, but the people who are, who he's trying to save. So
it could represent you, right? Or a person. It could represent Jesus on the cross, right? And that I think also can represent our planet, right? The lost, you know, the 99 and the 1.
yeah.
So are these real though? They are, right? They're real. And in some ways, this is the real thing, and this is just the story, right? It's a real, there are real sheep and everything. But in the context of parables, the sheep is the not real thing, it's the storybook picture. And this is what we're really talking about. And I will do one more. We have a symbol of an angel. And what does an angel represent?
Messenger.
Messenger, right? So if I drew William Miller here, or you know, any other messenger, and he's got his chart, and he's a real historical person. He's real, yeah? So we can see that these things are real. Even though we kind of use the word spiritual. The word spiritual sometimes to us makes it sound a little bit fluffy and cloud-like and airy-fairy, but they're real, the real things. And I think sometimes another issue we have is that some of the things that are being taught to us are like, they're not concrete, or they're sort of a bit intangible. They're sort of like conceptual ideas. So if I put them in here, we have the kingdom of heaven. Right, it's real, but and it's also, you know, long-lasting term. But for us, it's really hard to get our hands onto what it actually looks like, and it doesn't seem real in some ways. Or we have the idea of truth. Yeah. So if we're talking about a symbol such as, you know, manna or bread or rain, water, these ideas that illustrate the spiritual meaning for us, you know, an idea like truth, is it real? Yes, truth is real, isn't it? Truth is a real thing. So spiritual meaning of the symbols are real things. Again, we have something like wisdom. Or we would have the idea of life, or even God. And these are things that we want to understand and learn, and they're real, you know, life, God is real, and these are all real things. So spiritual here, we couldn't consider them as not real, even though they feel, it feels sometimes like the things that we see are the real thing. And here we also see that Jesus here is the spiritual meaning, but you can also put Jesus over here because he is the example of what God is like. So we can see that as well. Something that has a, you know, even the idea of so some of these parables, they kind of get reused and build on each other. So we see, we're going to look at Gentiles. We see literal Gentiles, and then we can see a kind of a Gentiles during the Dark Ages, and then we can see Gentiles in our dispensation today. And each one becomes a type of the next one that we look at. So the Gentiles of the Dark Ages are kind of like a type of the Gentiles today, but they're not exactly the same thing. So some of these things can become like the literal symbol then for the spiritual. So, okay, so we're going to look at these two verses, Luke 21:24. And Revelation 11, 1-2. Those two verses use some symbols. They both have some symbols in common. Does anybody remember what those symbols are? It's been a while, so I'll just give a second. So jump in quick if you remember what they are, otherwise I'll list them. So we can keep moving through. We compared these two verses right at the end of my last study. We underlined the words that were the same in both verses. No, okay. I'll write them down and we'll look at the verses. So here we have the symbols of Jerusalem. We have Gentiles. We have the idea of a treading down. And we have the idea of time and times. Okay. So these four terms are all common to both of those passages, which is why we're going to proof text going from the Gospels into Revelation 11. That's the reason why we're going there. So I think I've covered everything there. And also it's important we're going to look at the context of these verses so we know whether we're supposed to use literal or spiritual when we look at these terms as well. So that's important. Alrighty, let's see. So we're just remembering what Christ's discourse had. We've done this twice already. These are the three chapters where he speaks about this same prophetic narrative. I've marked 31 as the beginning. That's where he basically starts talking from. And then he talks about this whole storyline, and all the verses continue all the way through in order. They're going in sequential order until we get to the final part there, which is about coming on the clouds. And we've talked about how we're applying that to 1844 because it's the judgment, the investigative judgment begins there. So there's a coming on the clouds. So that's how that narrative goes through to there. I think we did discuss briefly, you know, what if Jesus had come in 1863 and so forth. I'm not sure, but it's not much difference anyway. But 1844 is where we're marking that, and that's important when we're applying this way, because it takes us to 1844. And so you can see there that what Jesus is talking about is 70, which is a type of this. Okay, the destruction of Jerusalem is a type of this Dark Ages. And then we see he's speaking of the Dark Ages, so we know 538 is there. That's a 2520 related way marker time. He speaks about 1798 because that's the end of the Dark Ages. So that date is brought in, and then we have 1844. So I hope that you can see how this all connects with the 2520, because that's basically the key dates we have when we have both 2520s. So Jesus is basically making one story out of all of those dates, and so we know it's all one related, for one topic. I put past rapidly here because when we get down to this little junction here, all the years between 70 and 538 are basically almost like ignored. And in doing so, he's made one waymark out of those two. Just discounts all that happens in between there. He connects how Jerusalem is being destroyed spiritually here with how it's being destroyed literally here. So he's brought these two waymarks together, and that's important because he's connecting paganism with papalism. And so that's an important feature. And the verses that we're concerned with in every case, so we're going to Revelation, we're going to Daniel, they're all related to here, to this very point where this connection is made. So Jesus really wanted to teach us, not so much the disciples, because he just quickly passes over because it would be too much for them to bear, but for us, he wants to teach us how they're connected. And so we can pick that up from this Gospels. So he passed rapidly over that. It really wasn't the right time for the disciples to handle all of that bad news, I suppose. So he just briefly mentions, and you get that down here. And then he, finishes off with what happened in that Millerite era. So here is where we get Luke 21:24, and we had these key words that I just mentioned. Jerusalem, we had a treading down, we have Gentiles, and we have times. And these are the symbols that we can see when we're heading from a literal destruction into a spiritual destruction. We can see Jesus is now transitioning into the Dark Ages, because we have the times of the Gentiles here, it being fulfilled down here. All right, so we have a transitioning there. He's speaking about one, then he's speaking about the other, but the disciples then on the rise, I don't really understand that. But we understand that. So that's how that verse bridges us from literal to spiritual. So here's the literal features we're going to be using here. We have Jerusalem. It's on the mountain there. We have an army, missiles. So that's the literal destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So the first part of this verse we have, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. And we can see just, the verses leading up to this is all about this dispensation here. I've got numbers 1, 2, and 3. That means history 1, history 2, history 3. That's all just been sectioned there. So here we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So let's list, so we've got here this idea of the literal, right? So we've got literal Jerusalem, here we have literal Jerusalem. We have literal Jews. We have literal Gentiles. These are some of the terms that we're going to be looking at as we look at these verses from Revelation and Daniel. So we have a literal temple back in this dispensation. We have we can call Jerusalem, it's also called the Holy City. So we'll see that term come up, the Holy City. There is an outer court, okay, literal outer court in the temple, and we'll be looking at the temple today. We have a literal abomination of desolation here. Okay. We will talk about that when we go into Daniel. We have literal time as well. Yeah, and there's a dividing wall, because that's another thing we're going to talk about, dividing wall. The dividing wall, separating the inner court from the outer court in the temple. So these are some of the things that are relevant for our study as we try to understand 1844, which is the end of the 2520, the whole thing. All right, so, and right here, okay, get red. This is basically an overview of still where we're heading. We've got these 4 verses. Okay, so I've got the Luke 21, 24, which is the one that I've put here, and I've got the arrow going up to here, so you know where in his discourse he mentions this thing is there. So this Luke 21, 24 is from here. We also have in another book a verse that comes at a similar time, and that's Matthew 24, 15. And that's where we're speaking about an abomination of desolation. So that's also mentioned here. Then what we're going to do is proof text, and we go to Revelation 11, verse 2. Okay, we'll examine that verse momentarily, but we use proof texting and go to here. So we know, even though the context of this verse is not here, it is speaking of this event, the 70 AD event, and brings in the Dark Ages as well, because we see the same words here about Jerusalem being trodden down by the Gentiles for a period of time. So we see the same thing being spoken of here, the Dark Ages. So that's why that's all, I'm saying everything happens around this point, which again is where we're connecting pagan and papal. And these themes that we have, the pagan to papal is relevant for the 2520, understanding all of that. And then this verse here, Matthew 24, 15, will be the one that takes us to Daniel 9, 27. And again, that will be through proof texting. And we won't do this one today, but we will move on to that one as soon as we finish with Revelation 11. So that's where we're heading. The point there about all 4 of these is that they connect 2520 themes about treading down, things about Jerusalem. We see the same themes coming up, the 2520 related themes. We also see these 4 passages, well, 3 really, because these are both from Christ's discourse, but these 3 different narratives will also connect the important dates of the 2520. And what we're really, we really want to see these 2 connected, because they're the 2 different 2520s models that we had been given from Edson and Miller. So if these are connected to each other, or if this one is connected to 538, we see the bringing together of the 2 2520s. So we can see here the dates 70, 538, 1798, and 1844 keep coming up over and over again when you look at these. So that's the beauty of it all. I think it's quite, I think it's lovely what God has done in His Word to that everything kind of fits together and clicks into place. So okay, yes, so we're ready for the next stage. So I'll just write up Revelation 11 verse 2. So, but the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 40 months. Okay, so we have holy city and Jerusalem. We have Gentiles. We have Gentiles here. We have tread underfoot, trodden down, and we have 40 months, and we have times of the Gentiles. So it's quite a few proofs there that proof texting is valid, and obviously it's very closely related. So what we're going to see, that this verse here is speaking of, well, it's related to this one, so it's got to do with the literal destruction of Jerusalem, so it's got to do with 70 AD. Then it's got to do with the Dark Ages, so it's got to do with 538 to 1798, because we've got the 42 months. 42 there. That ends in 1798, and then the reason it connects, it does connect to 1844, and the reason it connects to 1844 is because that's the context of when the verse is given. So we'll look at that now as well, because we want to prove the context. In the narrative in Revelation, when this comes up, is when John is being taught, John has been given Revelation 9, then 10, then when he gets to 11, he's here. Revelation 11, 1 and 2 is the context here. Okay, so the context is here when he's told in the narrative he's given. And then there's this throwback to these periods here are also tied into 1844. So Jesus is telling him, when you get to here, I want to remind you of this. So we'll look at that. But that's, you can just see already that these 4 dates are all connected to this verse here. Okay, let's look at verse 1. Okay. All right. Just to fit it in, I'll just write, he was to measure, the sanctuary, the altar, and those worshipping in it. Okay. All right, so this is Revelation 11 verse 1, when we arrive around here, and we see these symbols coming up here. Actually, I'll draw out, I was going to draw it for you, just how those Revelation 9 and 10 fit into the, and bring us to the chapter 11. So I'll just draw that here. Clean it. so it's pretty clear how this is connected to the Dark Ages and all of that, but this is now just focusing on 1844 and why we're saying the context is 1844. So if we draw this period of time, we're going to illustrate where we have 1449, 1840, and 1844. We have Revelation 9 here, going from there to there, and it's speaking of the second word. Okay, and then we have Revelation 10 here. And that's the sixth trumpet. Okay, from there to there. Oh, no. Yeah, that's right. Okay. And then we get to Revelation here. Down here. This is all a continuous narrative, this one. When we look at Revelation 10, we have here at verse 1, the idea they had spoken of the mighty angel coming down. And then we have verse 6 is time no longer. And then we have verse 11, verse 9, belly bitter, belly would be bitter. And verse 11 here, it says that they have to prophesy again. And that's in verse 11. Okay. And that's the last verse of chapter 10. And that's where you get up to here. So does that verse there apply to 1844, that they're going to have to prophesy again? And what does that mean? So we know that the Millerites did some investigation here. When they got to 1844, we have investigation as well. Wait a sec. We have to remember that we're talking about a sanctuary model as well. So I'll just underline those words. Sanctuary. And we've got the altar. We have those worshipping in it. And we have a measuring. Okay, and all of this comes in here as well. Couple of ways we can connect this to 1844. We know that we are the temple, and with regard to the altar was built up of 12 stones, and the 12 stones represented the 12 different tribes. So that's another way of illustrating that the altar here is God's people. The measuring here is an examination, and if you actually the verse in Zechariah chapter 2 verses 1 and 2, I'll read them to you. I lifted up mine eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then said I, whither goest thou? And he said unto me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth thereof and what is the length thereof. So we can see that measuring of Jerusalem is like an investigation. So can we bring investigation into here? Investigation. At 1844. Yes, we can, can't we? Because the investigative judgment is going on. So we see an investigative process happening both to the Millerites and by the Millerites. So they are being investigated, and we'll read a passage from 7 BC that shows that. I'll put the quote up, the reference. BC. 9.2.1. So, are the Millerites being investigated? This is what Ellen White said. It's the little subheading I have there is called Measuring the Church of God. And she said, the grand judgment is taking place and has been going on for some time. I'll just insert there that this was written in 1888. So the measuring has been going on for some time. And here we have measuring, that's why we're reading this. Now the Lord says, measure the temple and the worshippers thereof. Remember when you were walking the streets about your business, God is measuring you. When you are attending your household duties, when you engage in conversation, God is measuring you. Remember that your words and actions are being photographed, she uses another old-fashioned word, in the books of heaven, as the face is reproduced by the artist on a polished plate. Here is the work going on, measuring the temple and its worshippers to see who will stand in the last day. Okay, so by 1888, the measuring of the Church of God has been taking place for some time. So the Millerites and those were being measured at this point here from this time onwards. We know that in the typical investigative judgment, the Day of Atonement, there was an investigation going on, but there was also the Jews Israelites were required to afflict their souls and rid themselves of sin. They were required to investigate themselves as well. And here we see a process of investigation going on with the, not just personal investigation, which I'm sure was going on, but also as a movement, they investigated the doctrines that they were holding. If you remember, they did the review process. They went back over all the things that they had held to leading up to 1844, and they sat down and looked at them again and decided, you know, they investigated everything they had studied up to that point, and they re-investigated it. Not only that, but they had new light coming about the sanctuary, so they were investigating also the sanctuary and the new light that was coming as well. So we see investigation going on, we see measuring. So we can see that that's, it fits in well with what was going on at that time and the people that we're talking about, the Millerites. We also know that prophet represents God's people when we look at sometimes Daniel when he refers to himself, or John in those books, it represents what is happening with God's people. And see here, this it was given to me. So it was given to God's people, a reed like a rod to measure. Okay, so we see here, I'm going to draw it as a measuring ruler. Okay, and they're going to investigate what? The sanctuary. Okay. And we have in the sanctuary belongs Jews, which would be modern Israel. And we have that there. It's being measured here at this point. So that's where we are when we get to Revelation 11, verse 1. And then here we have a mentioning of a court. Okay, so we have here a dividing wall. And then we have a bigger space around called the court. So Jews could be in here, put a little walkway. Jews could be in here, that'd be a Jew, and out here is a Gentile. Okay, and we can see when we get to 1844, there's mentioning of measure this part, but don't measure this. So one group is being investigated or investigating, and one group is not. And when John is speaking of himself here, he's speaking of this group of people here who are doing measuring and being measured. So there is this court which is without the temple, and it's not to be measured. And this here is given to Gentiles. And then it tells you, it just reminds you of the Dark Ages. And it sort of ties in the Dark Ages with that, but it's not speaking of the Dark Ages. This part here is speaking about 1844. So these two verses here will connect 1844 to 1798 because it's speaking of 1844, but it's reminding you of the Dark Ages, which ends in 1798. Yeah, so I think that's all I have to say, except that another thing here, they were doing ridding of sin is part of the Day of Atonement, and they were ridding their movement of cherished doctrines that they could no longer hold to. And so they were ridding themselves of doctrinal sin, I guess you could say. Yes, and the other thing I wanted to bring in here was the different kinds of Gentiles that we see. So we have Gentiles here. I'll do it in red. Gentiles. Okay, so this is talking about Gentiles here in 1844. There's a line that connects you to those Gentiles. But it's also talking about the Gentiles of the Dark Ages. Okay, so it reminds you of the 42 months, and there's Gentiles there. Okay. So it connects you to that. And these Gentiles will remind you of the, literal, in 70, you had Jew and Gentiles. Okay, Gentiles there's Gentiles here, and there's Gentiles here. But this is a change of dispensation. And when Christ moved from the holy place to the most holy place, you have a change of dispensation. You have Gentiles here. It's not the same as these Gentiles here. And we have to take these as types to learn what this is. And that's what this verse is telling us. Take this as a type to understand who these Gentiles are. But what we really want to focus on now is the wall. So when we see that there is a court, there has to be, and there's two groups that are distinguished from each other. We have a wall that appears here. So I'll draw another picture. Actually, I've got it ready. We see a wall appear again. Okay, so 1844, here's my picture. And this is what we want to focus on now, the wall. All right. And that separates two classes. So we'll draw someone in here and somebody out there. Who are they? How do we know who the Gentiles are today? Okay, so let's look at the literal. We have a Jew here, and we have a Gentile. Okay, and this is the court. Here we have the court. But only these are measured, and these are ignored. That's what we get from that verse in Revelation 11:1-2. So what we want to know is there's a wall. What is it? And we have two classes of people. Who are they? Okay. Now I'm going to screen share. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Could I ask for a volunteer to read the first passage, please?
I read
Thank you.
Ministry of Healing. Christ might have occupied the highest place among the teachers of the Jewish nation, but he preferred rather to take the gospel to the poor. He went from place to place, that those in the highways and byways might hear the words of truth. By the sea, on the mountainside, in the street of the city, in the synagogue, his voice was heard explaining the scriptures. Often he taught in the outer court of the temple, that the Gentiles might hear his words.
Thank you. Okay, so these are just proofs to show that only Jews were allowed in the temple. So when we're looking at the literal, we can see the Gentiles have to stay outside in the outer court. So it's just to make that literal clear. Just for time, I probably won't get you to read the next three because we still have a fair bit I want to get done. I will write the references up on the board though, so in case you want to look at them afterwards, hopefully photograph the board, you can have a look. So DA 1933 and 622.1, and we also have, or you can quickly scan through like Paul 215. No, it's 216.2. Okay. All of those quotes, they're just explaining that there's Gentiles in the outer court and Jews in the inner court. So hopefully everybody is reasonably familiar with that. But what I do want to look at now is the separating wall broken down. So could someone please read, if you wouldn't mind, just read both, please. Ephesians and Spirit of Prophecy quotes, please.
I can read that if you like.
Please do, thanks.
Ephesians 2:11-14. Wherefore remember that ye being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh, made by hands, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, ye whom sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. And then the Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 3. The message of the Greeks, indicating as it did the breaking down of the partition wall between Jew and Gentile, brought before Jesus his entire mission, from the time when it was first decided in heaven that he should come to earth as man's Redeemer, to the death that he knew awaited him in the immediate future.
Thanks, Lynn. Okay, we have some more quotes as well, but I think we'll probably, let me just see if there's one I might read. Let's read the early writing. Let's read the last two. If someone can volunteer to read the last two there from early writings and Bible commentary.
I'll read.
Please.
And hung up the cross and cried, "It is finished." The veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom, to signify that God would no longer meet with the priests in the temple to accept their sacrifice in advance, and also to show that the partition wall between the Jews and the Gentiles was broken down. Jesus had made an offering of himself for both, and if saved at all, both must believe in him as the only offering for sin, the Savior of the world.
Okay, thanks. I'll do the Bible commentary one. God urged Paul out of the great work of preaching Christ and him crucified. Circumcision or uncircumcision was nothing. The Judaizing party looked upon Paul as an apostate bent upon breaking down the partition wall which God had established between the Israelites and the world. So you can see there that they recognised that Paul was working on breaking down that partition wall between Jew and Gentile. Okay, so I'll put those references up there. So what we can see here is that there's a wall here, but when we get to this time, we see the wall has been broken down. We can see that from those quotes. But when we get to Revelation 11, 1 and 2, how come there's a division between two classes again? Because here it said there wasn't any, and now there is. And if there's a division and one section is getting measured, there has to be this separation here, this wall. So the wall is back, and we can see that in these verses, especially given the context of 1844 and the measuring and investigating and everything that's going on there. So there's a class of people that are in and there's a class of people that are out. And who are they? And what is the wall? We have some quotes to talk about whether the wall is good or bad. We did cover this last time. So I'll just illustrate it, and we probably won't read these quotes either because I'm just keeping an eye on them. So we have the idea of here's the Jews on the inside. Put a picture of a Jew there. And there's the wall. It's supposed to be a low wall. Here's the inner court. And that's the outer court. And they're really supposed to be able to communicate with each other. And we can see here that even in this dispensation here, there was a literal wall, but there was also a spiritual wall of separation. The Israelites were supposed to remain separate from the nations around them. So this resembled something that was even had a spiritual meaning in their own day. And likewise today we have a spiritual meaning. There's an inner court and an outer court, and we have Gentiles. Now this wall, this is a good wall. It's a good wall, and it was it's a wall of protection, and it was ordained of God to have this wall of separation. So applying that to us today, we have something that separates us Jews from Gentiles. And if you know what that wall is, then you know who is the Jew and who is the Gentile. But we also have this idea of a bad wall, and it might remind, bring back your memory that this is what man has done. Okay, man has done, this is bad, and this is a wall of pride. So if we read the quotes, we would see the wall being spoken of as a good thing and ordained of God, and a wall of protection. Or we see other quotes which speak of a wall is bad, and God did not intend for there to be a wall that would cut people's sympathies off and cut the Gentiles off from getting the knowledge that they would need to learn about God. So we have this idea of a wall. So this wall, which is here, it's good, but we're not to build on it and make it so high that Gentiles cannot enter, they cannot learn. So I'll just mention that in passing, just as a reminder, so we can move on. The wall, the quotes about, yes I do. Okay, I'll share screen again. Okay, so there's some quotes about the good wall and the bad wall, but I won't read them now for time. Okay, could somebody please read this quote here from Early Writings? The wall is the Sabbath.
On page 33 is given the following. I saw that the Holy Sabbath is and will be the separating wall between the true Israel of God and unbelievers, and that the Sabbath is the great question to unite the hearts of God's dear waiting saints. This view was given in 1847, when there were but very few of the Advent brethren observing the Sabbath, and of these but few supposed that its observance was of sufficient importance to draw a line between the people of God and unbelievers.
Thank you. And if someone could read the Desire of Ages. Yeah, just that one there. I'll just leave it up there. If somebody could read that Desire of Ages quote.
Well, speaking of Israel, he said, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctified them. Make them holy. Ezekiel 20:12. Then the Sabbath is a sign of Christ's power to make us holy, and it is given to all whom Christ makes holy. as a sign of his sanctifying power. The Sabbath is given to all who through Christ become a part of the Israel of God.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll stop sharing. All right, so what we have here is a wall. You can see there that the quotes there tell you that the wall is the Sabbath. So then you know who's actually inside and who is not. So there are many Protestants denominations that don't keep Sabbath. And so they actually don't qualify to be the group that's being measured because the wall is the Sabbath. We can see that. So in 1844, we see that wall is returned. And we see a group of people that are set apart. And that is the significance of what 1844 is. And 1844 is the end of the 2520, the culmination of all of that work that God had to do to bring restoration, bring back a group of people that are commandment keepers in covenant. So we see there that in 1844 we have the wall, and we also have a couple of quotes about God's denominated people, but the denomination of the people isn't until 1860. So how does that fit in with 1844? So we have 1844, and we have that wall here. So we draw that group. We'll have that around them. Okay, that's where we're saying the wall is back. So we see the wall there, and we see covenant, and we see commandment keeping keepers. So they're in and they're getting measured. And that's what we get from Revelation 11, 1 and 2 in 1844. But the denomination here is 1860. So here we see that they're named. Okay. So how can these people be modern Israel, but they don't actually get their name until there? So is that okay or not? It's fine. It's actually perfect that it happens this way. We see here that they're getting rid of, during this time period here between 1844 and 1860, they're ridding themselves of cherished sins. Okay, so there's a process going on with growth here. 1844, they're just starting to learn some new things, some new truths. But we see by 1860, they're ready to be named. Now, what's that similar to? So this is modern Israel. Let's look at literal Israel. And when I say literal Israel, I mean Jacob. Okay, what happened to Jacob? What happened at Bethel? Covenant, right? Made a covenant with God at Bethel. But did he have cherished sin still in his life? Yes, he did. But by the time he gets to Jabbok, he's been ridding, or God has been through a process ridding himself of cherished sins. Okay, and here he's named. All right, so we see that lines up really perfectly. We see character growth here, just like we did for the SDH. So even though here they are considered to be God's covenant people, and they're separated now from the Gentiles around them, their name comes later, but we can still consider them as God's people from 1844 onwards. So we would say that SDAs would be classed as Jews, the antitype of literal Jews. Protestant, like others, the world would be classed as Gentiles. The 2520s achieved its purpose by the time we get to 1844 because it's taken a group of people that were rebellious and brought them, cleaned them up through this process and made it so that there's a group of people that were keeping covenant again. And once I got to 1844 and going through this process, there was no particular need for the second advent to be far off. Really, the main work had been done and Jesus was ready to return quite soon after that, once the message was able to be spread abroad. However, that did not happen, but there was no need for there to be such a delay as there has been. So what we learn from all of this is that 2520, this passage in Revelation 11 verses 1 and 2, it does three things. Okay. It connects the themes of the 2520. Okay. It has the theme of treading down. It's talking about Jerusalem, all of those themes that have to do with the 2520. It connects the dates of the 2520. Okay, including we need 1844 and 1798 to be connected, which they are, and I hope that that's clear. And then it also gives us the meaning. Because what's the point of knowing some dates if you don't understand what the point of the 2520 was, what it tells you happened? It needs to tell you who God's people are and who they aren't, where you're supposed to be, which group you should find yourself in. So we see that the 2520, the meaning is really, we could learn a lot there by seeing what happened in 1844 in these two classes and how special Seventh-day Adventists have been to God ever since 1844, and how much He cares and wants to rescue as many of the Levites. So yeah, we see these themes coming up in Christ's discourse. We see the same themes coming up in Revelation 11. Christ's discourse and Revelation 11 are connected through the proof texting, and so I hope that that's been clear, but you can ask questions. And then next time when I present, I'm hoping to then move forward into the other passage from Mark, which proof texts and leads us to Daniel. And hopefully that will help us to become firmly established in our understanding of important prophecy. So let's close in prayer and then I'll open up for any questions. Please, Neil. Dear Lord God in heaven, we thank you so much for our community. We can come together and study your word. We thank you for these prophecies and the types and antitypes, all the symbols, all the structures, chiasms, all of these things that we can analyze and use as tools to understand the biggest meanings that we can, extract the meanings about higher concepts, spiritual things, things that are outside of our vision, things that are beyond what we can actually see with our eyes. We thank you for giving us, again, these tools. Thank you for all these words of inspiration that become a library we can use to discover more about the nature of your kingdom, who and what we are, and our role in this world. I pray that you would help us to be solid in these things and to have faith, Lord, understanding the past, that we may have faith for the future. Please be with us for the rest of this Sabbath week. In Jesus' name.